Welcome to Panels, a series of conversations hosted by Modem about our complex relationship with technology. My name is Emily Segal, moderator of the series. Today, we explore the value of the archive and the topic of cyberfeminism. In an age of anxiety that we may outlast our cloud providers, what is the value of a feminist index and archive? How have our concepts of archives evolved, and how will they continue to? What does it mean to examine feminism in dialogue with history, with futures past, and with the future itself? Those are some of the questions we'll look into today. I'll be talking to Francesca Gavin, editor-in-chief and co-founder of EPOCH, as well as the artistic director of Vienna Contemporary, and Mindy Seu, designer and technologist based in New York, currently teaching at UCLA, and the force behind the Cyberfeminism Index. Welcome, Francesca and Mindy.
Hi, thank you so much.
So the sort of jumping off point for today's conversation had to do with this meme, for lack of a better word, or something that I've been noticing with increasing frequency online, which is basically people warning each other about what to do when the internet goes down, or really starting to freak out about widespread internet blackouts, outages, what it might mean to back up everything you have, kind of this sense that everything is now sort of uploaded somewhere. And we've become quite accustomed to a certain way of relating to information and media, and also our own memories and sentimental things and documents, et cetera. And now, for whatever reason, or this is, I guess the reason is something that I would love to discuss with you, people seem to be really getting nervous en masse about what might happen if those structures started to break down. So I always think that cultural anxieties are an interesting jumping off point for looking at, changes and trends in society. And that's sort of where this question of the archive, which is, at the heart of both of your practices, among many other themes, of course, that's sort of where this came from in terms of something that connects it to the present. So I guess where I wanted to start was, what do you think of that meme? What do you think of that anxiety? Do you share this anxiety? And yeah, let's start there. Either one of you, feel free to jump in.
I'm going to dive in because it reminds me of an amazing sci-fi novel called Memoirs Found in a Bathtub by Stanislav Lem. And you only have to read the first page. The concept being it is a satire on Soviet politics of the time. And the concept is all ink has disappeared and therefore all records go. And the rest of the book is essentially about society crumbling and falling apart. It's hilarious and also ridiculous and immensely possible and incredibly apt for now. And which is probably why when I get very special emails, I print them out, why I'm obsessed with making printed version of the archive, because I think we're all very aware that the way technology has sold us as this infinite superhuman floating information in the ether is a lie.
But I also wonder if part of this is we're currently living in the archive. Everything that we do is kind of automatically saved, and that means that the intention of saving is gone. So when you say that you print out sentimental things, I think it's less about print being more durable, but more so it requires some intentional forethought to actively save something. So I print out some things for sure, but I also go out of my way to just duplicate or triplicate in multiple settings, whether it's in the cloud, on a hard drive, on multiple backups, or et cetera. Because I think for digital archiving, this duplication is really key. Because yes, things will fail. But I also think we have to question why we want to save everything to begin with. I think being a bit selective about that is important.
I mean, it's interesting. I think because I come from a library fetish background,
Me too.
for example, I've done a radio show for 8 years, and obviously that's a radio show. It's all archived online at NTS. And last year I did transcriptions of the first 5 years of those interviews with artists, because I'm conscious that at some point that radio station may not exist, and I wanted to have a printed, let's say, version, because it's never the same as the original take on what you're doing. Or even if you're going in between different forms of technology, we all know there's a shift in how a video piece, a conversation, an editorial thing changes between media. But I like having, for me, there's a paper hornist, but I think it's also generational for me because I'm just at the generation, it's before the internet was the only access of it. So I remember cutting up things like come from magazines, which is probably why I still do a print magazine.
I mean, I love paper too, and I think it's so complementary. I think this translation between media is really nice because the affordances of that thing kind of reveal a different quality of what you're trying to save. So like an audio recording is searchable in a very different way than a textual transcription. So having both of these generally is good for querying anyway.
I mean, there was an amazing exhibition a few years ago that Ed Atkins curated of the Julia Stozzek collection in Dusseldorf, where he was and there was a really good research in it about how do you maintain video work when you're moving between media? Like what happens when VHS dies or DVDs aren't there, or we're not looking at CD-ROMs anymore, etc. So I think there's something really fascinating around those elements of translation and reception and archiving, because it is fundamental. How does the archive work? I mean, obviously, Rhizome's been incredibly influential in terms of the archiving of digital material, the kind of material that you've been using in the Cyberfeminist Index. And I've been really conscious of that because before that existed, I was very aware things seemed to be just sort of temporary.
This actually might be a good segue into some questions that I have about format and the role of format in archiving. Obviously, EPOCH is a magazine, and I'm sure also engages many other forms and disciplines. And then Cyberfeminism Index is a website that collates an enormous amount of information as well as a book. So I would love to hear if there are any reflections about as you already started to do, about the function of those different formats or the types of considerations that go into putting information into different formats, especially when engaging an archive.
Do you want to start, Mindy? And I'll dive into mine.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the Cyberfeminism Index, we are almost trying to think about these multiple media formats as a sort of hack. People assume that books are more authoritative, they're more legitimizing, they're more finite. So because we started off as an index, an online index, that's really serving as like, hopefully in perpetuity, a living index that's constantly crowdsourcing, it's open access, it's open source. And then the book then serves as a snapshot of a moment of that website's mutation. So since the website was frozen for the manuscript in like 2021, there's already been like 500 or so additional entries into the online index. And I like how these things are not so mismatched. On the website also, you can also click whatever you want, download it as a PDF and print it out on your own, much to the disdain of my publishers. So you could go out and buy my snapshot, my book, or you can print out a version of your own. And I like this multiplicity. I like this idea of making multiple snapshots that all act as like a different reflection of what the viewer was trying to save at that time.
And also it's so wonderful in terms of accessibility of information, because part of the joy of printed forms of archive is reference books, the idea that there is a longevity of multiple uses of that. And like people are looking, like I could be looking at your index for different topics and different things at different times. That wouldn't negate me wanting to buy the print version.
No, yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah. I think also what you're saying about this idea of like a reference point, I'm very interested in like citations and citational politics. And another reason why we wanted to do this printed book in an official way, with an ISBN in the Library of Congress, was because then we suddenly had like 700 citations of a lot of types of works that haven't been cited before in print. So this created a whole slew of secondary sources for platforms like Wikipedia that really require secondary sources. So it's kind of a hack in that way too.
Yeah, I remember when I wrote a book on a relationship to screens called Watch This Space. It came out in 2017. And in it, I became super fascinated with those kind of thinking, like the disintegration of that, the idea, like, for example, I would be taking blog posts and now they're inserted into like a printed format. I like the idea of the elevation of what was seen as kind of very meme-like or ephemeral, which is also part of the pleasure of
Yeah.
technology and how we consume it.
Before we move on too far, I realized it would have probably been smart for me to ask you to actually just say very briefly what Cyberfeminism Index is. Same with
Yeah,
EPOCH. So if you feel like working those into your responses, I think that
sure.
would be helpful for those listening at
Absolutely.
home.
Yeah. The Cyberfeminism Index is a record of, I don't know, an ever-growing collection of online activism and net art from the past 3 decades. From 1991, the book is until 2020, but the website goes on in perpetuity. So it's very much being crowdsourced now, and you can check out cyberfeminismindex.com and add your own.
And EPOCH is a biannual publication that actually it's only produced 2 copies so far, launched, which I co-founded with an amazing creative director in Paris called Léonard Vernet. And you can look at it at epoch-review.com, though we are only a print magazine at this point. And it essentially is an incredibly beautifully produced publication that looks at history in the long now. So the now, trying to come up with new dialogues on how we can look at the future in a utopian positive way by mixing the deep past, the present, and the future. So I kind of describe it as a psychedelic postmodern take on National Geographic with better politics.
And
better
what, maybe it's a good moment to hear a little bit more about what inspired you to start it and also the choice to be print only.
Leonard approached me. Essentially, he was in a creative direction duo called Il Studio, and they split up, and he wanted to do a magazine about the wholeness of civilization. I had come up with the name Epoch when I was 21. Before I had even become a journalist, I basically used to phone up book publishers and go, "Hi, I'm from Epoch. We're a new magazine publishing. Can you give me free books?" And then I saved it. And it's a long-term manifest. And when he said he wanted to do a book about something about civilization, it was like a perfect fit. And we just started working from that, still at the ends of the pandemic. The first issue was created complete with him in Paris and me in Vienna. Print was always fundamental to what we wanted. We have a lot of space for, let's say, fashion photographers or just general creatives to do 20-page features, the kind of personal projects that you would not normally have the space to get in other printed material without an emphasis largely on heavy fashion shoots. So the first issue was based around the concept of ritual. The second was metamorphosis. The third issue coming out actually in June will be prophecy. So there's always like a slight underpinning, let's say, of kind of esoteric titles, but very much grounded in covering everything from archaeology to contemporary art to science to music, and very transhistorical, very transgenerational. I'm very into like archive photographers. We've had people like Liz Johnson-Arter, who's like a older photographer, or Lara G, for example, who helped launch our event in Paris when we first came out. But I think for me, I like the timelessness of a print document. I like the idea that print was something, I mean, I remember doing research about how we absorb information on screen and in printed form, and we actually retain it differently, like physiologically. And so for me, I really wanted to play in the longevity that comes into the printed document. But yeah, I love it. It's a very beautiful thing. It's the most beautiful. I mean, I've been in editorial for a long time, and it's definitely the best magazine I've ever touched. So that's a good beginning. It's my fantasy.
I want to pause and reflect on the concept of prophecy for a moment, because what comes to mind hearing the word also in terms of the Cyberfeminism Index is that there's something very Cassandra-like about a lot of the early cyberfeminists. There are so many visions of the internet and of society that were not necessarily listened to, or some of them totally came true. Some of them were thwarted. Some of them sort of fell on deaf ears. But there's I always have this sense looking at some of the very early cyberfeminist works, provocations, communications, that they are sort of prophecies. in and of themselves. I was wondering if that's ever something you thought about, not to put words in your mouth, but I'm wondering about that, or the sense of relating to the future from the past that comes through, that you must have also, maybe you've encountered kind of putting together all of these different elements for the index.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really apt because as an index that's really collecting a lot of historical artifacts, even if they're paired with very contemporary entries, a lot of these are really trying to talk about a current context and a way to escape that or combat that or flourish within that by suggesting some sort of alternative future. So generally, we hear a lot about like utopia shifting to dystopia, but this kind of like clear through line is too easy. There's so much like bumpiness and blurriness in between. When you kind of look at the different types of theory and praxis within the book, some of them are very much focused on here's an attainable change that we can make in the next 6 months to resolve something for our community. And some people are like, there's no way of resolving this, so we're going to just think of some fantastical future as a way to kind of decolonize our imagination and try to do some sort of long-term manifestation, as you just described. So this, I think, is really important. This moving away from this idea of utopia, which really implies a space, a specific context, or et cetera, and maybe moving towards a utopic principle instead. A utopic principle might be something that can be easily inserted, not easily, but still like extrapolated and then inserted into an existing context, rather than being so far off into the future that it feels completely speculative or imaginative. But I'm curious how you think about this too, Francesca. Like, not only utopia, but when you look at future, when past imaginings of the future, what are some through lines that you kind of observe?
I mean, it's really fascinating. I've been rereading Alvin Toffler's Future Shock, which is like obviously quite an iconic 1960s sort of McLuhan era media version about our culture shock, but with time and future and technology. And it's amazing how contemporary it feels to me. The tone of voice, this sense of fear, this sense of dysregulation by our relationships to technology while we're existing in it. It just amazed me. I felt like it could have been written yesterday, and I find that really fascinating. But I've also always been, I've always loved like the cultural output of Afrofuturism, though after speaking to a number of artists, I actually don't like using that language because futurism itself as a word is so linked to fascism in 1930s Italy. So I'm really interested in people trying to come up with new language on how we talk about what is essentially like sci-fi. But I think a perfect example is no matter what moment in history you're in for now, there's always a desire to rediscover something in the past and rework it. For example, the Ursula Le Guin's carrier bag fiction theory, it kind of existed, but it just floated away and then had a huge resurgence as it became more apt to a contemporary society. And everything I do, I think, comes down to Svetlana Boyne, who wrote an incredible thing called the Off-Modern Manifesto, which was quite big around 2010. Before she died, a Russian philosopher, I don't know if you ever come across her, she's incredible. But the idea about going back through modernism, finding different pathways that weren't used, and how you can go back to them and think of them as different alternative futures, I think that underpins everything I've done.
Yeah.
I think it's just an incredible way of, at this moment of, let's say, climate fear and global instability and war and just a lot of political unrest and emotional upset, there's something comforting in thinking, okay, what's our alternative ways out that aren't necessarily dystopic? So for me, that comes out of looking back and then left, or back and then right, or coming over, as opposed to that kind of, this is the end of history, millennial feeling.
Yeah, I think part of this is also trying to understand how prophecy works today. And I think maybe something that you were pointing at is this development of new names. Like Nema Gafair was pushing back against this idea of Afrofuturism. So instead they use Afropresentism. Or Legacy Russell's glitch feminism, or all these other terms that emerge, I think are apt ways of trying to understand what our current context is, to push away from an existing term from the past, and also suggest how we might move forward.
I'm also really fast. I mean, part of the reason why we wanted to do the issue, me and Leonard, was very much very interested in ideas around forecasting and looking forward. And actually, even within like a capitalist, commercial context, there's this obsession with how do we predict the future financially? What does that mean for us? Humanity seems to be and I'm really interested in looking. One of the pieces that we're commissioning is a conceptual thing about forecasting in a long future as opposed to just 3 seasons ahead. I find that really interesting. The idea about our interest in future forms of society and how that's living and why we're obsessed and how we come up with those suspected trends. Trend forecasting and futurology has always been like a really fascinating, I don't know, process. I think that kind of also says a lot about us now than it does more necessarily about how we're going to be living in 10 years' time.
Sure. But I mean, Emily, I wonder if you can kind of unpack this, because as you've done a lot of forecasting on your various collectives and organizations, do you focus more on like the short term or how that might reflect into a long term? What is your philosophy behind that?
So yes, I am a trend forecaster by trade. So it's one of the most fake sounding jobs a person can have. I think what's been really interesting about coming back to this practice in different contexts over and over again, starting in my early 20s when I had no credibility coming from the perspective of stuff I had done in the past, but I had the credibility of being kind of like a live walking and talking internet related millennial at the time, which was exciting instead of being totally passé. So the credibility was generational. And then over time, I actually built a practice. I think what was difficult in the beginning is that I actually was always really reflecting on the present. That's how it worked for me. It was like a process of pattern recognition that had to do with noticing concurrent signals and then extrapolating. And then what people wanted to hear, especially in a more corporate context, which I've been in and out of, is something that speaks with more certainty about the future. And then there's the paradox, which is that if there's a ton of information to back up your forecast, it's probably not the freshest forecast. So there's an enormous amount of rhetorical jujitsu necessary to sound credible, suggest a future, compel people, make them believe in it, keep open the possibilities that you might not get it exactly right, not forecast something too perfectly or too on the nose so that if something right in the next room happens, it seems like you're wrong. So it's almost like writing poetry or something. As a writer also is very compelling in that way because it's such a strange way of talking. It is prophecy. It's also fundamentally feminine in that way. It's like you're kind of being professionally hysterical. The more that I had the opportunity to sort of hone and define my own practice, and the more that I got to be picky as I got a little bit older about what I was responding to, the more I had an opportunity to reflect on things where I felt like I could be more honest about when I didn't know, when I thought something was really dangerous. Like when you're 21 in a boardroom for the first time, no one really wants to hear that you think what their company is doing is really dangerous. Like I learned this the hard way. Or no one wants to hear from you put very plainly that you think it's the dumbest thing you've ever heard in your life. And obviously, I still probably wouldn't say it like that to a client, but I can also just avoid things that I think are like that and speak more to questions and problems and projects that I think will actually appreciate my more idiosyncratic way of looking.
I mean, I'm going to say, sorry, you mentioned pattern recognition, which immediately brings to mind the William Gibson novel. I interviewed him around the time, actually, a couple of times when that came out. But
wow.
Another great, like, archive moment for thinking about the future. And I think what also is kind of fundamental when we're thinking about new ways of living is creativity. And actually, when we are looking for what was so wonderful about the main character, in Pattern Recognition, the novel, and the formation of this kind of weird game that was happening online and this kind of Chris Cunningham-esque world in which she inhabited was very much that it was about creativity, about art, about play. And I think that's something also really interesting, and we're coming up with this interesting intersection between the archival and the futuristic. I think that's where new ideas are coming out of. It's artists and writers and musicians who are really rethinking what our futures are. They're the ones to point a finger at, essentially.
Well, this is why I think the rise of like artist residencies in tech companies is because of this. Because historically, artists have been shown to break tools or use them in ways that are unintended or be critical of them or whatever. So the company then almost capitalizes on that because they know that artists need a lot of financial support for various reasons. And then they kind of get this trade. It's also some sort of like EDI tokenization too. Yeah.
But then actually, I'm obsessed with a lot of those in the 1970s when Apple and AT&T were inviting artists in, like Stuart and Charlotte Johannesson, for example, in Stockholm, or Malmo, actually, in to create creative work, or like, Rauschenberg or whatever.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And you get, so for me, actually, a lot of those, it's something that's been ongoing in some kind of way, that kind of intersection. But I like the fact that we're more conscious of it now. But then there is the historic, if we aren't archiving the historical elements of that, then you wouldn't necessarily know that. And it's really fascinating to see how the historic concept of that collaboration can work for me.
Maybe historically, maybe this is my naivete here to generalize, but when these artist residencies were happening, it felt like more of a partnership between the artist and the organization, like Bell Labs or Xerox PARC or some of these really experimental things in early MIT Media Lab. Yeah. It does not feel like that now. It feels like such a small wing that's kind of pushed to the side but used for promotion. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's where some of my cynicism comes from.
I think that's very fair.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Oh, just our relationships with corporations are both literally and figuratively much more toxic now than they were. So I think part of that just has to do with the way things were organized, the way things were run, obviously. And then it's just a different era. Like, we are both more enthralled to these big companies and more horrified.
I think I always bring up a book called The Secret War Between Uploading and Downloading by Peter Lunenfeld, which for me was the last moment where we kind of went from blog culture into, let's say, what is now something like Meta, where it was the individual creative platform from communication. I don't know, I'm almost thinking about reviving my blog there. I think there might be something really interesting on that. I mean, there's a reason why Substack, but however, even there, you're still working within the structures that have been defined by someone else to monetize. Whereas there was and like even in like a hardware format, like the way our phones and computers are structured, and they can't be physically hacked in the way that they used to be. I find that it was a closing in. So our feelings towards tech giants and those who make the objects we work on is valid. I mean, it's fair.
I do think blogging is coming back.
Good.
So I think you're on the right track there.
I've still got my blog spot. I think I might bring it back.
Okay, you need to revive it. One thing that came to mind as you two were just talking has to do with this other cultural meme, not the internet is going to go down and we're going to lose everything meme, but the nothing is really new meme, which I guess goes all the way back to Ecclesiastes and the Bible and everything like that. But there's nothing new under the sun. But in terms of, for example, in Hollywood, famously, the same IP being mined over and over again, rather than new things being supported and greenlit, is one very well-known, much remarked upon part of this. And then there's a slightly newer, but in my view, related part, which has to do with the way that work that's created with large language models might be kind of retreading a lot of old material or be kind of like deep fried or not new in the same way that we thought of something that just came out of someone's mind and then was written down, or an image was created fresh. Like if everything's being made out of a composite of things that are being kind of mashed up before. I'm curious how both of you think about those trends or through lines, and what you think of the anxiety around those things at the moment.
You want to
Yeah.
go, Mindy? Shall I? You go first.
I mean, I guess AI had to come up at some point in this. Well, I think with the Hollywood thing, this is just a clear example of being risk averse, right? Because we need to have something that proves that an investment, a huge investment, might be lucrative, right? This is just trying to drive on capitalist gain. The large language model thing is interesting because while it is making an assemblage of a lot of pre-existing things, we're only referring to the things that are part of these databases to begin with. Like, it doesn't account for all the things that aren't in these image sets or textual data sets or et cetera. So I think I want to see some like GPTs that, like, we could make a GPT from this conversation that we're just having now. Like, I wish there was some LLMs that were just a bit smaller or focused, and that could be tailored to specific people who might make that data set more specific, because then we don't have this conflation of like lack of citation, amalgamation of the most generic and mainstream things. That is why we're seeing this repetition over and over. But I think there are ways to change this. It just feels, I don't know, I'm rambling at this point, but I don't have as much AI anxiety as maybe some of my peers and colleagues. My PDOOM is relatively low, but that's just because I see it as part of a holistic system as all the other terrible things that are happening.
I mean, I always feel like I'm looking for, in particular, new aesthetics. I think that's the thing that I've always been drawn for. And the only time I think I've really felt it with AI was a program made recently by Universal Everything, which is essentially, it was like for outside of a building in Korea, I think a shopping mall, but it was like a fashion show that was done with these weird blobby, I've never seen anything like it. And it was the first time I've said that in a really, really long time. Even though it's still like is playing with the way people walk, the physicality of the fashion show, that kind of structural context, the actual characters, which are obviously constantly unique, were unlike anything I'd seen before. And that was really exciting to me. So maybe when it comes to the repetition of history and context and familiarity, I mean, maybe I quite like that. Maybe there are only, 10 keys on a piano and a certain number of chords, and maybe it's okay that humanity has a desire to reinforce its existence by the repetition of this. I mean, I became very much into Byung-Hal Chan's book Rituals when I was doing the first issue of EPOCH, because it was saying part of the problem is we're losing ritual as a society, which is making us feel ungrounded, let's say unconnected with each other. And perhaps narrative is a form of ritual which we reinforce in order to address our identities. So we know who we are, how we function, how we can communicate with each other.
But I do think this kind of amalgamation is definitely a form of authoring too, like how you bring the same amount of things together, how you sequence them differently, etc. But in terms of this remixing or repetition, again, it's going back to this idea of intentionality. I do think that when you're referring intentionally to something visually in your work, or if a curator is trying to connect them, even if the artist never intended that, it's trying to kind of create these echoes to create these through lines, because that's how we respond and adapt things moving forward. But throwing everything into a pot and seeing what comes out of it, I think there needs to be an intentional way to modify this thing for a specific use, even if that's also done in kind of a playful way to see what mistakes happen as well.
And I think we can all say that we all know who's putting together the data sets and algorithms in the first place. There's a lot of limitations around all of that. And
Yeah.
information is emerging and the influences. None of, technology, like everything else in society, is not unconnected to the people who create it, even AI at this stage. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll also give one reference. I really like the piece by Stephanie Dinkins, Bina 48, in which she talks to an automaton. It's definitely use of AI, but it's not trying to say like, I used AI, look at this weird thing that it spit out. Instead, it's trying to understand how it became a mirror of her, thereby becoming a mirror of like culture itself. So I think there just needs to be it's a layering process. It can't just be about like the novelty of the tool itself, because that just fades so quickly.
I'm going to also bring up an earlier version of that, of a very, very early computer program, I think in the 60s or early 70s, called ELIZA, which
Yeah,
is
of
one
course. Yeah.
that. And how that really, for us as humans, feel like we're being analyzed, like this was our psychoanalytical conversation or our therapist, because we want to understand ourselves through the mirroring of technology in some way.
I think that one of my responses, and maybe this is like for a shrink rather than for conversation, both to something like the anxiety that might be kicked up by the use of a large language model or the archival anxiety that we began this conversation discussing. I think that I have a kind of counterphobic thing where I'm like, oh, everything that was on my Facebook that for whatever reason I can't log into, fuck that. I'm gonna let it go. I obviously wouldn't feel like that about a novel I wrote. There are different types of information. I obviously wouldn't feel like that if it was the last image I had of someone that I really cared about who was no longer around. So I'm just talking about a certain class of things that could be nonetheless very sentimental or could jog a memory, but not like the most important things in my life. I feel like I tend to go to this place of like, let it go, or like, yeah, bring it on with the AI generated writing. Like, let's see. I mean, I've had a lot of fun playing with these tools as toys. I particularly like this site Pseudo-Write, SUDOWRITE, which is really popular among writers of sort of like fan fiction or fan fiction-esque writers, like these kind of community, really interesting kind of hobbyist writer communities where certain genre or certain type of text is really popular, and people tend to write enormous quantities of text as part of the practice. The tool is also useful for other things, but it's very popular with those communities. And it's really fun and weird if you kind of actively let go of your attachment to yourself. Of course, it's always a double-edged sword because you don't just want to let go of all your attachment to yourself and just let something really dark kind of come in and be the new norm without totally uncritically. And I also think that people kind of screw themselves up by bracing themselves too much against the future. I mean, this also goes back to the future shock thing. This goes back to the fact that historically been so many moments that people have been afraid of the future, so many moments that people have been afraid of new generations, that so there's something both totally like unique to the moment that we're in and completely common to all the others at the same time.
It makes me think of two things. One is an article I wrote years ago for the Sunday Times Style. I wrote it in an hour in a hotel room called Fashion Made Me Fat. And my argument was that if you're in a sack dress, you're going to fill it. If you're in a tight dress, you'll notice you're gaining weight. This was a meaningless piece for 10 years. It would be the first thing people would see when they Googled me. I think it was not good for my relationship status. Fashion made me fat. So when finally the Sunday Times archive removed it, I cannot tell you how happy I was. So for me, that was a case of hooray, goodbye archive. However, then I looked at that. It was a really fascinating, I don't know if you know, I think in Alsace or Frankfurt, there was an enormous fire of a server farm where the archives of businesses were destroyed. I think there was a writer in FAZ that described it as the Valhalla of our times. So much information was lost that would have been, bank records and financial documents. And I think that's when it becomes really interesting and takes me back to the Stanislas Lem I started off with. The idea of what happens when your passport goes, what happens when if we live in a totally digitized society and the internet fails, how do we function? That fear. And I think personally, I think it's valid, because I think it's comedic to think that even on we just need to form some other new kind of technology, arguably. But, in terms of, the ability of this growing progress of never-ending screens is unrealistic from a geological point of view, let alone anything else. So, but yeah, I'm happy to lose some of the articles in the world, though. I don't mind, I can't get my MySpace.
It does really bring the question of who has the right to disappear? Some people don't want to be visible online. There's so many things that we can't really remove now, or some people say that inundation is the biggest form of erasure. Regardless of information overload or etc., this hierarchy you're mentioning, Emily, I think is really important, because it goes back to this question of the things that we intentionally want to save, to put in a time capsule, to put in a grassroots archive with the community. Those are the things that we'll tend to more carefully. The other stuff is a after effect of how easy it is to save things now, but that doesn't mean they're actually as precious to us. So if it burns down, I think it's okay. This is kind of why some models like the Internet Archive, they are really using the metaphor of the Library of Alexandria, right? They're trying to save a house, the internet, as it's burning down. So they're really just doing save everything as quickly as possible and we'll deal with the repercussions later. But something like Rhizome's Conifer is trying to be more intentional. If you want to save a website in its dynamism, you can record it and we'll save it in perpetuity. So it's just a very different model. Neither is necessarily better or worse, but it just shows a different intention or anxiety around why we should save things and how we can let lay people start doing that.
Makes me think of Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, where they're trying desperately to save, historic works of genius. And then essentially you're like, who for? What for? Oh, well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're better in our imagination sometimes anyways. However, I still will print out special emails here and there.
Oh, I definitely do that too, yeah.
Yeah, any other practices or suggestions for people who are kind of grappling with this anxiety, like printing out special how do you kind of address your own archives? Could be in big or small ways. As any tips for
personally, I make scrapbooks. I always have. I'm a big fan of a scrapbook. So I literally cut things out and glue them. And that means I can save, and it's not a personal archive, it's a cultural one. So the occasional exhibition text, like images I see, all my book ideas have come out of it. It truly is, for me, I'm a print girl. But I also remember what UbuWeb said, that our website may not last forever. So if you want our stuff, download it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, even Paul Suella says downloading is a political act, because you are really choosing what should be saved instead of having someone decide that for you. Some of my practices, I do print out some sentimental things. I think that when we were first deciding to make a book for the Cyberfeminism Index, my publisher wanted to call it the Cyberfeminism Archive. But I argued that it actually isn't an archive. An archive really pulls things in. It's a silo and a safeguard. It's kind of like a vitrine. But an index is always pointing outward. Nothing in the index is holistic in any way. It's an excerpt, it's a still or something like this. So what we try to do then is fortify those links that point outward. And fortifying that means you duplicate it. If it's a PDF from JSTOR, you download it and put it in 2 other places. If it's a website, you link to the website, but also link to the emulated version on Wayback or Conifer. Like, so there's a lot of strategies here for just saving things in different places and different formats that I think is quite useful, but just takes a lot of tending to. Do you have any strategies, Emily?
I wish I had better strategies. I guess I'm lucky that I do a lot of writing by hand, so those things are kind of necessarily offline. And then I was really sorry.
I couldn't do it. I definitely couldn't write without the computer. Actually, the way I structure things,
Yeah.
you know.
It's a really interesting practice to experiment with if it's not something that you've done a lot of, because just in the same way that reading off the screen is different, writing off the screen is different, and the physicality of it, or they say the connection between your hand and your heart is different, although your heart is obviously still in the mix if you're typing on a keyboard. I was really relieved when my novel Mercury Retrograde came out, because in a way I was like, there's so many copies of it and it's in so many places that the chance that it will completely disappear is very slim now, which is kind of cool. Same with the Cyberfeminism Index or copies of EPOCH. Like, there's something really relieving about that. But I'm totally not organized enough to even scrapbook in the way that I would love to, I would love to have the outcome of that. And so we'll see if I can sort of start to implement.
One day my scrapbooks will be a book. I'm saying, give me another 20 years and then I'll print them.
Well, exactly.
I'm making the archive in advance there.
Well, and then they'll be even sturdier and harder to eradicate. So we'll make our marks that way. So this has been an absolutely fascinating and wonderful conversation. It's such a pleasure to talk to both of you. And thank you so much for joining us.